Beyond the Loop. Chapter 1. The Driftwood Stranger. On this island, time is not an arrow shot into the unknown. It is a perfect circle, traced in the sand by an invisible hand. Every morning, I wake with the terrifying certainty of perfection. The sun crosses the horizon at the exact same coordinate. The dew clings to the taro leaves in the exact same symmetry. I know every grain of salt on my skin. I know the groan of every piece of driftwood rotting on the shore. I am the silent curator of a museum of the moment, condemned to relive the same page of a book that refuses to turn. But today, the ocean made a mistake, a magnificent, frightening anomaly. He was there, washed up where the white lace of the foam dies, a jagged, dark silhouette against the soft, organic curves of my world. He was not a spirit, nor a fatting memory. He was a man. His clothes, a torn linen shirt, and dark trousers were steeped in a reality I no longer knew. The scent of jet fuel, the artificial chill of air-conditioned offices, the gray dust of distant metropolises. Beside him, his wooden board, scarred by the reef, seemed to be his only anchor in this drift. I watched him from the shadows of the great banyan trees. My heart, long accustomed to the metronomic pulse of the island, began to race, hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. To see a new face was to see a new color appear in a rainbow I thought was frozen forever. As I drew closer, the air around him seemed to vibrate with a different frequency. He radiated a feverish energy. His fingers twitched in the sand, tracing invisible lines, perhaps graphs, or numbers, or signatures, as if he were trying to rebuild his fallen empire in the middle of this desert paradise. Every line on his face told a story of haste, of conquest, and of chronic exhaustion. This was a man who had spent his life chasing time, never realizing that time would eventually catch him here, in this crystalline trap. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. They did not have the serene clarity of the island folk. They were a stormy blue, bloodshot, and filled with a cold, sharp panic. He did not look at the beauty of the palms or the crystalline water. His first instinct was to look at his wrist, a heavy watch of silver and steel, massive and silent. The hands were frozen. He tapped the dial with a frantic desperation, his face contorting as the seconds refused to pass. Here, the hands of man have no power. He pushed himself up awkwardly, his heavy limbs protesting against this new environment. He scanned the horizon with a desperate intensity, searching for a sail, a contrail in the sky, a signal. Anything but this infinite blue and this deafening silence. The shadows began to lengthen with an unnatural speed. The sky, usually so pure, began to curdle into an electric purple, the color of a fresh bruise. It was 5:55 p.m. The air grew thick, tasting of ozone and ancient electricity. It was the smell of the end of the world, or rather, the smell of its beginning. The man felt the shift. He froze, his eyes wide, staring at the horizon, which began to ripple like a mirage. The earth beneath our feet began to emit a low-frequency hum, a vibration rising from the depths of the volcanic rock. The ocean went still. The waves froze mid-crash, suspended like glass sculptures. Time was contracting, bracing for the great leap. The man turned his head toward me, and for the first time our eyes met. There was no arrogance left in him, no calculation, only a raw animal terror. He reached out his hand, not to call for me, but to anchor himself to the only other thing that seemed solid in this waking nightmare. Usually, at this exact moment, I close my eyes. I feel the world blink, a fraction of a second of nothingness, and I wake on my mat in the village, the taste of salt on my lips. The beach is empty, the sand is smooth, and the stranger is but an echo in my mind, scrubbed away by the great reset. The violet light hit the shore. It moved like a wall of cold fire, turning the sand into liquid gold. I stepped forward and seized his hand. His skin was searing, vibrating, shaken by a force that was trying to dissolve him, to erase him from the island's fabric. It was a war between the island's eternity and this man's reality. The light swallowed the palms. It devoured the mountains. I waited for the darkness, for the familiar void, for the return to the silence of morning. But the silence never came. Instead, a new sound tore through space, the sound of a heart beating against mine, an irregular, living rhythm, shattering the perfect symmetry of the cycle. The world broke, the loop derailed, and for the first time in centuries, we did not vanish. We were there, alone in the gathering gloom, as the stars, for the very first time, began to move across the sky. Beyond the loop. Chapter 2, The First Night. Lanny voiceover hushed, filled with awe. The world did not blink. The violet fire that usually consumes my reality did not bring the morning sun. Instead, it left us in a darkness so thick it felt like velvet against my skin. For 1,000 years, my eyes have never known the true absence of light. My nights were merely shadows of the day, a brief pause before the sun was forced back into its starting position. But tonight, the stars have escaped their cages. Beside me, the stranger was a ghost of motion. I could feel the heat radiating from his hand, still locked in mine. He was trembling, not with the cold, but with the shock of a man who has just watched the laws of physics crumble. He pulled away, his silhouette stumbling back toward the frozen ocean. I watched him reach out to touch a wave. It was no longer water. It was a wall of cold, jagged glass, locked mid-crest. The ocean had become a statue, a monument to the moment the clock broke. He fell to his knees. In the world he came from, time was a commodity to be traded, a resource to be managed. Here, he was witnessing its death. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw the sky as it truly was. The stars were not the static pinpricks I had memorized. They were moving. They were drifting across the heavens like glowing embers, charting a course into a future I had never been allowed to visit. The village was silent. I knew that in the huts behind the tree line, my people were trapped in a state between being and non-being. They were part of the loop, woven into its fabric. But we were outside of it now. We were the only two living things in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. I walked toward him, my feet sinking into sand that felt strangely cold, no longer renewed by the morning heat. He was staring at his silver watch again. The glass was cracked now, a spiderweb of fractures across the dial. But underneath the broken surface, the second hand had begun to move. It was a terrifying sound. Each tick was a footstep into the unknown. Each second was a bridge being burned behind us. He looked up at me, his face illuminated only by the frantic, moving stars. He didn't have to speak for me to feel his question. We were no longer in my paradise, and we were certainly not in his world. We were in the between. The silence was breaking. The island was reacting to our presence, to the weight of two souls that shouldn't exist in this frozen second. Deep in the jungle, a light appeared, not the violet fire of the reset, but a pale, sickly green glow rising from the heart of the island. It was a beckoning, or a warning. I reached out once more, my fingers brushing his salt-crusted sleeve. The warmth of his body was the only compass I had left. We could not stay on the shore. The ocean was a graveyard of frozen momentum, and the sand was turning to ash beneath our feet. We had to move toward the glow. We had to find why the clock had stopped for us, and what price the island would demand for our survival. The first night has begun, and in the darkness, I realized that I was no longer afraid of the loop ending. I was afraid of what was waking up to take its place. Beyond the Loop. Chapter 3. The Gears of Eden. The beach was no longer the sanctuary I had walked for 1,000 years. Under the moving stars, the sand had lost its warmth, turning into a gray, powdery ash that clung to our skin like the dust of a forgotten tomb. Behind us, the frozen ocean stood like a wall of jagged diamonds, motionless and terrifying. But ahead, the jungle had transformed. It was no longer a wall of green. It was a breathing, glowing labyrinth of shadows. Every step away from the shore felt like tearing a page out of a book. We were walking into the blank margins, the places where the loop had never intended for us to go. The stranger moved beside me like a man walking through a dream he couldn't control. He was no longer the titan of industry I had glimpsed in his eyes earlier. He was a child lost in a forest of giants. He kept looking back at the frozen sea, perhaps hopping to see a rescue boat break through the glass waves, or perhaps terrified that the ocean would suddenly shatter and swallow us both. His watch, that silver parasite on his wrist, continued its relentless tick-tock. It was the only heartbeat in a world that had forgotten how to pulse. As we crossed the threshold of the first palms, the scent changed. The salt and hibiscus were gone, replaced by something ancient and metallic, the smell of wet copper and deep, damp earth. The trees here were different. Their trunks weren't bark and wood, but a strange, translucent fiber that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent veins. Pale green light surged through the roots like slow-moving lightning, illuminating the ground in rhythmic throbs. The leaves above us didn't rustle, they chimed. They were heavy, crystalline, and as they brushed against one another in the stagnant air, they produced a sound like a distant orchestra tuning its instruments. I watched the stranger reach out to touch a hanging vine. As his fingers made contact, the green light in the plant flared to a brilliant, blinding white. He recoiled, his face illuminated in a harsh, clinical glow. For a second, I saw the terror etched into every pore of his skin. He looked at his hand, then at the vine, then at me. His silence was louder than any scream. He was realizing that he wasn't just on an island. He was inside a machine, a living, breathing engine of time that had finally malfunctioned. We reached the base of the Great Banyan, the center of the island. But it was not the tree I remembered. The roots of the Great Banyan had pulled back, revealing a gaping maw in the earth. A staircase of obsidian led down into a throat of pulsing emerald light. From the depths, the sound of the between rose to greet us. It wasn't the sound of nature. It was the sound of a clockwork heart, a massive, rhythmic thrumming that shook the very marrow of my bones. The stranger stopped. He looked at the descent, then at his cracked watch. The second hand was spinning faster now, blurred by a speed that defied logic. He looked at me, and in the darkness, I saw a flash of his old self, the man who navigated storms and conquered markets. He took a breath, a deep, jagged lungful of the metallic air, and stepped toward the abyss. We descended. The air grew colder, sharper. The walls of the obsidian tunnel were covered in carvings, not of gods or animals, but of gears, celestial alignments, and endless, repeating circles. It was the blueprint of my prison. It was the map of the loop. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. To see the mechanics of my own existence was to realize that I was never a girl, never a daughter of the tide. I was a component, a ghost in the machine. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opened into a cavern, so vast it seemed to hold its own weather. In the center stood a monolith of bronze and light, a tower of interlocking rings that spun in different directions, some slow as the growth of a mountain, others fast as the wings of a hummingbird. In the center of the rings, suspended in a sphere of violet fire, was a shadow. The stranger gasped a sharp, choked sound. He walked toward the monolith as if hypnotized. He wasn't looking at the machine. He was looking at the shadow inside the fire. He froze. His hand went to his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt. The shadow in the fire shifted, taking a form that was agonizingly familiar to him. A woman, Sarah, the name he had whispered in his sleep. She was there, held in the heart of the island's engine, a soul caught in the gears. I realized then that Elias Thorne hadn't crashed here by accident. He had been pulled. The island didn't want a guest. It wanted a replacement. The rings of the monolith ground to a halt with a sound that felt like the world's spine snapping. The violet fire flickered. The green light in the vines turned a blood red. The machine had recognized him. And as the silence returned, heavier and colder than before, I realized that the first night was not just a pause. It was a transition. The island was hungry, and Elias was the feast. Beyond the Loop. Chapter 4. The Heart of the Glass Machine. Lanny voiceover, her voice now strained, sounding breathless and haunted. The cavern did not just hold the machine, it was the machine. As we stepped onto the floor of the obsidian vault, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt sharp, as if the oxygen had been replaced by microscopic shards of glass. Every breath I took felt like a betrayal of my lungs. For the first time, I understood that the island's beauty was a skin, and we had just crawled beneath it, into the raw, pulsing muscle of the world. The bronze monolith before us, the tower of interlocking rings, didn't just spin, it breathed. With every rotation, a gust of ozone-heavy air swept past us, carrying the metallic tang of centuries. Beside me, the man Elias was no longer a stranger. He was a fragment of a mirror reflecting a tragedy I was only beginning to grasp. He stood paralyzed, his eyes locked on the violet sphere at the center of the engine. The shadow within the fire, the silhouette of the woman he called Sarah, was shifting. She wasn't a ghost, she was a recording, a soul caught in a perpetual loop of the moment before a scream. He took a step forward. The ground beneath his boots wasn't stone anymore. It was a grid of translucent tiles, and beneath them, I could see the gears. Millions of brass cogs, some as small as a grain of sand, others as vast as the village square, were churning in a river of mercury. They were the architects of my prison. Every time a gear completed a cycle, a day on the surface was born and killed. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as a tiny cog jammed, hesitated, and then snapped. The vibration traveled up through the soles of our feet. The entire cavern groaned, a sound of tectonic agony. Elias reached the edge of the violet fire. He didn't look back at me. He didn't look at the mechanical apocalypse unfolding beneath our feet. He reached out his hand, the same hand that had signed contracts and steered boards, and plunged it toward the flame. The moment his skin touched the violet light, the cavern screamed. The bioluminescent vines on the walls didn't just turn red, they began to bleed. A thick, dark liquid that glowed with an angry internal light began to drip from the ceiling, sizzling as it hit the floor. The emerald glow of the tunnel was gone, replaced by a strobe-like flickering of emergency crimson. I rushed to him, my hands catching his shoulders, trying to pull him back. But he was anchored. The machine was feeding on him. I could see the silver of his watch, that cracked, broken thing, begin to melt, the liquid metal running up his arm like a living vine, fusing his flesh to the bronze of the monolith. Lanny, internal monologue. The heat was unbearable, yet my feet were freezing to the floor. The air was a chaotic symphony of smells: burning ozone, salt, old blood, and something sweet like the hibiscus flowers of the surface, but rotting. The shadow in the fire Sarah turned. For a heartbeat, the violet flames cleared. She wasn't just a shadow. She was a hollow. Her eyes were empty sockets of white light. She reached out to Elia's, her fingers touching his, and in that contact, the entire island of Makana Point shuddered. The loop wasn't just broken. It was being rewritten. The gears beneath us began to spin backward. The Mercury River flowed uphill. I felt my own memories, the thousands of identical sunrises, begin to blur and dissolve. If the machine reset now, with him fused to it, there would be no Lanny. There would be no village. There would only be the fire. I looked into Elias' eyes. He wasn't fighting it. He was weeping, the tears evaporating before they could leave his cheeks. He was choosing the fire. He was choosing the loop, if it meant staying in that violet light with her. Stop, I wanted to scream, but the air was too thick to carry sound. I grabbed a discarded piece of bronze, a fallen tooth from a giant gear, and jammed it into the main drive of the monolith. The world turned upside down. Gravity failed for a sickening second. We were weightless in a sea of red light and bronze shrapnel. The machine died with a whimper that sounded like a sob. The violet fire vanished, leaving us in a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I reached out in the blackness, searching for the heat of his skin. I found nothing but cold, jagged metal. The island was no longer a machine. It was a beast, and we were in its stomach. Beyond the loop. Chapter 5. The Rot of Memory. Lanny voiceover, her voice now fragile, whispering as if afraid to wake the cavern itself. The machine didn't just die, it rotted. When the violet fire vanished, it didn't leave us in the dark. It left us in a world of ghosts. The obsidian walls of the vault were no longer solid. They were sweating a thick, translucent ichor that smelled of old photographs and dried flowers. The silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight on my chest, pressing the breath out of my lungs. I reached out into the void, my fingers trembling, searching for the man who had shattered my eternity. I found him slumped against the base of the silent monolith. He was still fused to the bronze, but the metal had turned cold, a dead, leaden gray. The liquid silver that had climbed his arm was now a jagged scar, a permanent mark of the island's hunger. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the space where the fire had been. In the dim, sickly green light that still pulsed feebly from the walls. I could see his eyes. They were no longer the eyes of a hunter. They were hollowed out, filled with the debris of 1,000 memories that were no longer his. The air began to shimmer. The between was collapsing. As I sat beside him, the cavern walls began to bleed images. I saw a skyscraper of glass and steel piercing a gray New York sky. I saw a boardroom table where men in suits argued over numbers that meant nothing to the tide. I saw Sarah, not the shadow in the fire, but a woman in a yellow dress, laughing as she stepped into a taxi. The island was exhaling Elias past, vomiting his life into the obsidian vault. Elias reached out to touch the image of the taxi, his fingers passing through the shimmering light like smoke. He let out a sound, not a cry, but a whimpering moan of absolute loss. The island was mocking him. It was showing him everything he had traded for a handful of salt and a broken surfboard. But then the images shifted. My memories began to leak out too. I saw my mother's face 1,000 times over. I saw the same sunset, the same ritual, the same bowl of poi. But the images were decaying. My mother's face was melting into a mask of bronze. The sunset was turning into a wall of purple fire. The island was showing me the truth. My paradise was a construction, a beautiful cage built on a foundation of rusted gears and forgotten souls. I felt a sudden, sharp nausea. The metallic tang in the air grew sweet, sickeningly sweet, like fruit left to rot in the sun. The machine was no longer made of metal. The bronze rings were being strangled by thick, pulsing roots that grew before our eyes. The island was reclaiming its heart. It was no longer a machine of time. It was becoming a predator of flesh. The green light turned a bruised, sickly yellow. He didn't use words. He made a sound of surrender. He leaned his forehead against the cold bronze of the monolith and closed his eyes. He wanted the rot to take him. He wanted to dissolve into the memories of Sarah, even if they were just light on a wet wall. I grabbed his shoulders, my nails digging into his skin. I felt the vibration of the island through him, a deep, rhythmic throb that felt like a predator's purr. "We have to go," I whispered, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. "The first night is almost over. If the sun rises and we are still down here, we won't be people anymore. We will be parts, just more gears in the rot." The floor beneath us began to soften. The obsidian was turning into a dark, viscous peat. We were sinking. The island was beginning to digest its variables. I pulled at him with everything I had. The scar on his arm flared with a dull, silver light. With a scream that tore through the stagnant air, he ripped himself away from the monolith, leaving a patch of skin, and silver fused to the dead metal. We stumbled toward the obsidian stairs, but they were gone. In their place was a vertical tunnel of thorns and pulsing veins. We climbed, not with hope, but with the desperation of rats fleeing a drowning ship. Behind us, the cavern let out a long, low sigh of disappointment. The memories on the walls screamed one last time before flickering out. And as we reached the surface, I realized the first night was ending. But the sky wasn't turning gold. It was turning the color of an old bruise. Beyond the loop. Chapter 6. The Shadow of the City. Lanny voiceover, her voice now rasping and weary, yet filled with a terrifying lucidity. We emerged from the throat of the earth, not into the paradise I had known for 1,000 years, but into a nightmare of steel and chlorophyll. The first night had not ended with a sunrise. It had ended with a transformation. The jungle was no longer just trees and vines. It had begun to mimic the world Elias carried in his mind. The great banyans had stretched upward, their trunks squaring off into sharp, obsidian angles that resembled the skeletons of skyscrapers. The vines that used to drip with sweet nectar were now thick, black bundles of copper cabling, pulsing with a sick, blue electricity that hissed in the damp air. The air was a suffocating shroud. It smelled of wet concrete, ozone, and the bitter metallic scent of rusted iron. I watched as a hibiscus flower bloomed before my eyes. Its petals were not velvet, but thin, razor-sharp sheets of tinted glass, reflecting a sky that was no longer blue, but a bruised, smog-choked gray. Beside me, Elias was a ghost in a suit of scars. He walked through the brush as if he were navigating a boardroom he had long ago abandoned. He didn't seem surprised by the transformation. To him, this was the only reality left. The island was simply reflecting his internal rot, building a tomb of glass in the heart of the Pacific. We reached the ridge overlooking the village. I stopped, my breath catching in a throat that felt like it was lined with ash. The huts were gone. In their place, the island had birthed a cluster of low, windowless concrete blocks, strangled by bioluminescent roots. My people, they were there, but they were no longer breathing. They stood like statues of gray clay in the middle of the square, their eyes open and fixed on a horizon that had disappeared. They were caught in the between, frozen artifacts of a loop that had crashed. Elias stopped at the edge of the cliff. He looked down at his hand, the one fused with the silver scar. The metal was spreading. It was moving up his neck, a fine mesh of wires and mercury-tinted veins, mapping the geography of the machine onto his very soul. He didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at the center of the island, where a massive spire of glass and bone was growing toward the clouds, reaching for a heaven that had turned its back on us. "It's beautiful," I whispered, though the words felt like poison. I didn't mean the sights. I meant the sheer, brutal honesty of it. The island was no longer pretending. The mask of the tropical sanctuary had been torn away to reveal the engine of our collective sorrow. We began the descent into the new city. The ground was a mosaic of mud and asphalt. Every time I touched a leaf, I felt a faint vibration, a data stream, a memory of a stock market crash, a whispered phone call from a world 3,000 miles away. The atmosphere was an ocean of static. It pressed against my eardrums until I tasted copper. I looked at Elias, and for a fleeting second, the glass skyscraper behind him seemed to align perfectly with his silhouette. He was the architect, and I was the foundation he was crushing. We reached the base of the great spire. The air here was so thick with ozone that sparks danced between our fingertips. The between was reaching its limit. The island couldn't hold this much reality and this much myth at the same time. The fabric of the world was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing the white, empty void beyond the code. The shadow of the city had swallowed the sun. We were standing in the heart of a civilization made of ghosts and gears. Elias looked at me, his eyes now two flickering screens of white noise. He reached out his silver-veined hand, and as our fingers brushed, the entire island let out a final, agonizing groan. The last sunset was coming, and it wouldn't be red. It would be the color of a dead channel. Beyond the loop. Chapter 7. The final sunset, the dead channel. The end did not come with a bang. It came with a thinning. We stood at the summit of the great spire, the jagged peak, where the island's ancient stone had fused with the cold, unfeeling glass of Elias' memories. From here, the world was no longer a place of earth and water. It was a flickering tapestry of light and shadows, a dying projection on the back of a god's eyelid. Below us, the shadow city was dissolving. The skyscraper trees were losing their geometry, blurring into streaks of gray smoke. The frozen ocean was evaporating into a mist of pure data, white pixels rising like ghostly snow toward a sky that had ceased to exist. There was no sun. In its place was a great void, a vast, circular aperture in the heavens that pulsed with the sickly, gray light of a television tuned to a dead channel. Elias stood at the very edge of the glass precipice. He was no longer a man. He was a monument to the collision of two worlds. The silver mesh had climbed his throat, weaving into his jaw, turning his skin into a translucent map of glowing circuitry. His eyes were no longer focused on me, or the island, or even his lost Sarah. He was looking into the void. He was looking at the exit. I watched a single tear fall from his eye. It didn't hit the ground. It floated, suspended in the zero gravity of the island's final collapse, a perfect sphere of salt and sorrow that reflected the entire world one last time before it vanished. The atmosphere was an anchor. It felt as if we were walking through honey, every movement requiring a lifetime of will. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient, rotting hibiscus. It was the smell of a dream that had stayed in the sun too long. I reached out and touched his shoulder. My hand felt numb, the sensation of my own flesh fatting as the island's code was deleted. Elias, I whispered. My voice didn't travel through the air, it vibrated directly into his mind. The loop is gone. The city is gone. There is only the choice now. He turned to me. His face was a mask of flickering light. For a heartbeat, I saw the man he was, the surfer, the lover, the titan. And then I saw the machine. He reached out his hand, the silver veins glowing with a final, desperate brilliance. Beyond him, in the center of the great void, the silhouette of Sarah appeared one last time. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was a door, a gateway back to the world of linear time, of aging, of death, and of reality. But to walk through her was to let the island die. To walk through her was to erase the 1,000 years I had lived in a single day. If he stayed, the island would reboot. A new loop would begin, fueled by his soul instead of the machine. I would wake up on my mat. The sun would rise at 6:00 a.m. And he would be the new great spirit of the island, a ghost trapped in the gears forever. The tension in the air was a physical force, a wall of static electricity that made our hair stand on end. The gray light from the sky began to bleed into a deep, final purple, the color of the reset, but darker, more permanent. Elias looked at Sarah. Then he looked at me. In his eyes, I saw the crushing weight of the essential. He realized that to love the world is to let it end. To love a person is to let them go. He didn't speak. He simply stepped back from the edge. He chose to stay. He plunged his silver-fused hand into the glass of the spire, anchoring himself to the island's core. The silver mesh exploded across the floor, weaving into the obsidian, into the roots, into the very atoms of Makana Point. He was becoming the new engine. He was rewriting the loop with his own heartbeat. The great void in the sky began to close. The gray static was replaced by a warm, golden glow, the first real sunrise in a millennium. But as the light hit me, I felt the familiar weight of the blink. My memories of the first night, of the Shadow City, of the Obsidian Vault, they began to smooth out like a ripple in a pond returning to stillness. I looked at Elias. He was fading into the glass of the spire, becoming a statue of light and mercury. His eyes met mine one last time. There was no terror. There was only a profound, infinite weariness. Goodbye, Elias, I thought. But the thought was already dissolving. I blinked. I woke up on my mat. The salt had the taste of déjà vu. I walked to the beach, the sand smooth as an unwritten page. I knew every grain. I knew every shadow. I looked at the horizon. The sun was rising at exactly 6:00 a.m. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, a feeling of a missing piece I couldn't name. I looked at a large cedar log that had washed up on the shore. Beside it, the sand was disturbed, as if someone had been lying there. But the beach was empty. I picked up a small shard of silver glass from the sand. It didn't belong here. It felt cold. I stared at it until the heat of the sun made my eyes water. The loop is perfect again. The island is beautiful. But as I watch the sun climb the sky, I feel a ghost beside me. a memory of a shadow that chose to stay so I could be free to forget. I am Lanny, and today is the first day of forever.